Her ex took everything, but forgot the tool barn her grandfather left in the will. If you've ever had to start over from nothing, if you've ever felt like the world had counted you out, then hit that subscribe button and stick around. Because this story is for you. The key was cold in my hand. Not the sleek, new key to the apartment I no longer lived in, but an old skeleton key, heavy and pitted with rust, its teeth worn smooth with time. It was the only thing in my pocket besides a crumpled bus ticket and $17. Liam had made sure of that. The rain began to fall, a thin, miserable drizzle that plastered my hair to my forehead and soaked through the thin fabric of my jacket. It felt appropriate, a sky weeping in solidarity. The door to the apartment building clicked shut behind me, a sound of absolute finality. I didn't turn to look. There was nothing left to see. My life, or what I had thought was my life for the past 2 years, was contained in a single cardboard box at my feet, the corners already softening in the damp. 2 years of my life, gone. 2 years of believing in something that was, in the end, just a meticulously constructed lie. Liam had been so charming, so attentive. He found me when I was at my lowest, fresh out of the foster system at 18, blinking in the harsh sunlight of a world I didn't understand. I had nothing, and he offered me everything. A home, a future, love, or at least a very convincing performance of it. He'd called me his little orphan, at first affectionately, then later with a sneer I didn't recognize until it was too late. He knew I had no one, no parents to call, no siblings to rush to my defense. My grandfather, the only real family I'd ever known, had passed away a year before I met Liam, leaving me truly, terrifyingly alone. Liam saw that loneliness not as a wound to be healed, but as a space to occupy, to control. He was methodical. He encouraged me to quit my job at the coffee shop to focus on my art, something I hadn't touched since I was a kid. He convinced me to merge our bank accounts for simplicity. He slowly, skillfully, cut the threads connecting me to the few friends I'd made, whispering doubts, manufacturing slights, until my world had shrunk to the size of our shared apartment. And then, when I was completely dependent, completely isolated, he pulled the plug. It wasn't a dramatic fight. It was a quiet, clinical extraction. He sat me down and explained, with the calm of a surgeon, that it wasn't working, that he needed his space. The next day, the money was gone from the joint account. The day after that, new furniture, his furniture, he clarified, was delivered to replace the pieces we'd bought together. He handed me a box and told me to pack my personals. He was so calm, so practiced. It was the chilling efficiency that broke my heart more than the betrayal itself. He hadn't just left me. He had erased me. Now, standing on that wet sidewalk, the city noise a dull roar around me, I felt like a ghost. The box at my feet contained a few worn paperbacks, a chipped mug my grandfather had given me, and a change of clothes. Everything else, the savings I'd painstakingly built up, the sense of security I'd cherished, the very identity I'd tried to form, had been liquidated. I was 20 years old, and I had nothing. Less than nothing. I had the aching void where a life used to be. I clutched the old key in my pocket, its cold weight a strange comfort. It was the key to my grandfather's tool barn, a place I hadn't seen in years. He'd given it to me on my 16th birthday. "Every person needs a place to fix what's broken," he'd said, his voice raspy with affection. "This is yours." At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. Now, it felt like a prophecy. It was the only thing Liam hadn't known about, the only thing he couldn't take. A week later, I was sitting in a sterile beige office that smelled of weak coffee and old paper. The name on the door read, Henderson and Associates, Legal Services. Mr. Henderson was a man who seemed to be made of the same beige, uninspiring material as his office. He peered at me over a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, his expression one of professional, dispassionate pity. He had been my grandfather's lawyer, a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. "The situation is, as I explained on the phone, quite straightforward, Maya," he said, tapping a thin folder on his desk. "Your grandfather's estate was heavily in debt. Medical bills, mostly, from your mother's illness years ago, and then his own. He took out a second mortgage, then a third. He sold off most of the land parcel by parcel to keep his head above water." I nodded, my throat tight. Liam had known all of this. He'd done his research. He'd once casually mentioned how my grandfather had run the family legacy into the ground. A comment that stung at the time, but now felt like a calculated jab, designed to reinforce my own sense of worthlessness. "After he passed," Mr. Henderson continued, "the bank foreclosed on the main property, the house, the 5 acres it sat on. It was all sold at auction to cover the outstanding debt. There was nothing left. I'm sorry." "I know," I whispered. He sighed, a dry, rustling sound. "Your ex-boyfriend, Mr. Vance," he said the name as if it were a piece of evidence, "called my office 6 months ago, inquired about the status of the estate. I told his legal representative the same thing. The estate was insolvent. He was very thorough." My stomach churned. Of course he was. He had been planning this for months, ensuring there was nothing for me to fall back on. No inheritance, no family home, no safety net. "However," Mr. Henderson said, leaning forward slightly, a flicker of something almost like interest in his tired eyes, "he wasn't thorough enough. Your grandfather was a peculiar man. He loved loopholes. In the final disposition, he had the property subdivided. The main parcel, Lot A, was the house and the valuable land. But he created a Lot B, a 1/4 acre, technically landlocked, with no road access and no utilities. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a property deed. My name was typed at the top. He left you Lot B, the lawyer stated. It contains, and I quote the addendum, 1. Dilapidated tool barn and its contents. It was deemed to have negligible value, less than the cost of the paperwork to seize it. So the bank, and by extension Mr. Vance, ignored it. It's yours. Free and clear. Hope, a fragile, unfamiliar thing, fluttered in my chest. A place. My own place. Mr. Henderson held up a hand, quelling my nascent optimism. "Now, before you get any ideas, let me be clear. The structure is almost certainly condemned. The property taxes, while minimal, are due in 3 months. My professional advice, Maya, is to sell it. A local developer has been buying up all the surrounding parcels. They'll probably give you a few thousand for it just to consolidate the plot. It's not much, but it's more than nothing." He saw the look on my face. "It's a shed, kid, a falling down shed on a patch of weeds. Don't build a dream on a rotten foundation." I thought of the key in my pocket. I thought of my grandfather's words. A place to fix what's broken. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was a rotten foundation. But it was the only one I had. "I want to see it first," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Mr. Henderson gave a small, weary shrug, as if to say, "It's your funeral." He handed me a copy of the deed and a bus schedule. As I left his office, the beige door closing behind me, I had a direction. It wasn't much, but after weeks of aimless drifting, it felt like everything. I was going home. The bus ride was a journey through the layers of my own memory. It rumbled out of the city's concrete heart, leaving behind the gray canyons of glass and steel where my life with Liam had played out. With every mile, the buildings grew shorter, the spaces between them wider, until the cityscape dissolved into the sprawling, anonymous suburbs, and then, finally, into the rolling green and gold of the countryside. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the world blur by. I remembered making this same trip as a child, tucked beside my grandfather in his rattling old pickup truck. The city had been a place of thrilling adventure then, a place we visited for special occasions. The countryside was home. He would point out landmarks: a leaning oak tree that looked like a tired old man, a red barn with a crooked silo, the distant shimmer of the reservoir. "Never forget where you come from, Maya girl," he'd say, his hand resting on the back of my neck. "The land holds memories." Now the memories felt sharp, painful. I remembered the smell of his workshop, a heady mix of sawdust, oil, and pipe tobacco. I remembered the satisfying heft of his handplane in my small hands as he taught me to shave a piece of pine into a smooth, silken board. He was a carpenter, a craftsman. He could make wood sing. He built tables that felt like they could last 1,000 years, chairs that seemed to know the shape of the person sitting in them. His hands were gnarled and calloused, but they moved with a gentle, certain grace. He was a quiet man, but when he spoke, his words had weight, like the old-growth timber he loved. The bus wheezed to a stop at a lonely crossroads marked by a faded sign. "End of the line," the driver called out, his voice kind. He watched me as I stood up, my single box clutched in my arms. "You sure this is your stop? Ain't nothing out here but fields." "I'm sure," I said, managing a weak smile. "Thank you." He nodded, his eyes lingering on me with a flicker of concern. "Take care, kid." The doors hissed shut and the bus pulled away, leaving me in a cloud of diesel fumes and a profound silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. The air was different here. It was thick with the smell of damp earth, cut grass, and something wild and sweet I couldn't name. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the road. The lane my grandfather lived on was just ahead, now little more than 2 dirt tracks disappearing into a tunnel of overgrown trees. I hoisted my box higher and started walking. The half-mile walk felt like 10. The lane was choked with weeds, and branches clawed at my clothes. With every step, a feeling of dread grew in my stomach. I was walking toward a ghost, a memory. Mr. Henderson's words echoed in my mind. "The house is gone." I tried to prepare myself, but how do you prepare for the erasure of your own past? I came around the final bend and stopped. The breath caught in my throat. It was worse than I had imagined. Where the small white farmhouse should have been, there was only a raw, rectangular scar in the earth, a concrete foundation, cracked and filled with weeds and rainwater. The great maple tree that had stood in the front yard, the one with the tire swing, was gone, just a wide, pale stump. It was a scene of utter desolation. It was as if the heart had been ripped out of the land, leaving a gaping wound. I walked the perimeter of the foundation, my sneakers crunching on loose gravel. I touched the place where the front door used to be, where my grandfather would be waiting for me, a wide smile on his face. I saw the ghost of the kitchen window where he'd stand and watch the birds at the feeder. Tears I didn't know I had left began to stream down my face. I cried for the house. I cried for the tire swing. I cried for the man who had built a life here, only to have it all scraped away and hauled off like trash. And I cried for the stupid, lonely girl who had let a wolf in the door because he offered her 4 walls and a roof. Liam hadn't just taken my future, he had profited from the destruction of my past. After a long time, the tears subsided, leaving me hollowed out and cold. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world was painted in shades of purple and gray. I almost turned back. I almost walked away, ready to call Mr. Henderson and tell him to sell the damn patch of weeds to the highest bidder. But then I saw it. Set back from the foundation, partially hidden by a stand of overgrown lilac bushes, was the barn. It was just as he'd described it, dilapidated. The roof sagged in the middle like the spine of an old horse. The paint, once a cheerful barn red, was peeling away in long, curling strips, revealing weathered gray wood beneath. One of the big sliding doors hung crookedly on its track. It looked tired, forgotten, but it was still standing. Unlike the house, it had survived. It was stubborn. A flicker of my grandfather's own quiet resilience seemed to emanate from it. I wiped my face on my sleeve and walked towards it, the old iron key suddenly feeling warm and heavy in my palm. This was it. This was Lot B. This was all I had left. The closer I got, the more daunting the task seemed. The ground around the barn was a thicket of thorns and waist-high grass. The big sliding door was jammed shut, its lower track buried in years of accumulated dirt and debris. But next to it was a smaller, man-sized door, the one the key was for. The lock was a chunk of solid rust. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. I slid the key in. It grated, refusing to turn. For a frantic moment, I thought it was the wrong key, that this whole trip was a fool's errand. Panic seized me. I jiggled it, pushed it, pulled it. Nothing. Then I remembered something my grandfather had taught me about old locks. Patience, Maya girl. Don't force it. Persuade it. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried again. I applied steady, gentle pressure, feeling for the faint click of the pins inside. I turned the key back and forth, a fraction of an inch at a time, whispering encouragement to the rusted metal. And then I felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible give. A faint click. I turned the key, and with a groan of protesting metal, the bolt slid back. I pulled the handle. The door swelled in its frame, stuck fast. I put my shoulder into it, grunting with effort, and it finally gave way with a screech and a puff of dust, swinging inward into darkness. The smell that rolled out was thick and ancient, the smell of trapped time. It was dust, decay, and dampness, but underneath it all was the faint, familiar perfume of old wood, machine oil, and cold metal. It was the smell of my grandfather. I stepped inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The interior was vast and shadowy, the only light coming from the open doorway and a few grimy windows high up near the eaves. Dust motes danced like fairies in the slanted beams of twilight. The air was heavy and still. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, hung from the rafters and draped over every surface. It was a mess, but it was an organized mess. Tools hung in neat, ghostly silhouettes on the pegboard walls. Saws, hammers, wrenches, drills, each in its proper place, waiting. A massive workbench stood against the far wall, its surface scarred with the marks of 1,000 projects. Jars of screws and nails lined the shelves above it, their contents obscured by a thick layer of grime. In the center of the room, a large table saw was shrouded in a canvas tarp, looking like a sleeping beast. It was a tomb, a monument to a life of work that had ended. The sight of it all, so perfectly preserved in neglect, was overwhelming. This was his sanctuary, and it had been sitting here, silent and alone, for years. I ran a hand along the workbench, my fingers leaving a clean streak in the dust. I could almost feel the phantom vibration of his saw, hear the rhythmic rasp of his plane. I felt a profound sense of trespass, of invading a sacred space. But then I remembered his words, the deed in my bag, the key in my hand. This wasn't just his space anymore, it was mine. My box of belongings felt flimsy and pathetic in this temple of solid, useful things. I set it down on the floor, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence. I needed light. I fumbled for my phone, its flashlight cutting a sharp, clinical beam through the soft, historic darkness. I swept the light around the room, taking it all in. Stacks of lumber, neatly piled in a corner, were covered in a fine layer of dust. A drill press stood like a metal sentinel. And then the beam landed on something under the workbench, tucked away in the deepest shadows. It was a heavy, dark green metal box. The kind the army uses for ammunition. It had a sturdy latch, secured with a small, rusty padlock. My heart started to beat a little faster. People don't lock up empty boxes. Getting the box open became an obsession. The padlock was small but stubborn, and I had no key for it. I looked around at the walls lined with tools, my grandfather's entire arsenal at my disposal. It felt like a test. The problem and the solution all in one room. I chose a thin-bladed screwdriver and a heavy ball-peen hammer. It felt wrong, like I was committing an act of violence against his memory. But the need to know what was inside was stronger. I wedged the tip of the screwdriver into the padlock's shackle and struck the handle hard with the hammer. The clang echoed through the barn, loud and sharp. Nothing. I did it again, and again, my frustration growing with each ringing blow. The metal of the cheap lock began to deform, but it wouldn't break. I was sweating, my hands shaking. Patience, Maya girl. Don't force it. Persuade it. I took a breath and looked at the tools again. Brute force wasn't the answer. My grandfather was a man of precision, not violence. My eyes scanned the wall and landed on a pair of long-handled bolt cutters. They were heavy, coated in a thin layer of rust, but the hinges moved smoothly when I worked them. This was the right tool. The jaws fit perfectly around the shackle. I squeezed the handles together with all my strength. There was a moment of resistance, a deep groan from the metal, and then a loud, satisfying snap. The lock fell to the dusty floor. My hands trembled as I lifted the heavy lid of the box. I was half expecting to find cash or old bonds or something of immediate, practical value. Something that would solve my problems. But the contents were far more precious and far more complicated. There was no money. Instead, nestled on a bed of yellowed cheesecloth, was a thick package wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. Beside it lay a set of rolled-up blueprints, faded and soft as cloth. With reverent slowness, I lifted the oilskin package out. It was heavy, dense. I untied the twine, my fingers fumbling with the knot. I unfolded the stiff, waxy cloth. Inside was a thick stack of paper. The top sheet was a letter, the handwriting on it instantly, achingly familiar. It was my grandfather's strong, slanted script, written in dark fountain pen ink. "My dearest Maya," it began. I sank to the floor, my back against the leg of the workbench, and began to read. The world outside, the setting sun, my own hunger and exhaustion, it all faded away. There was only the letter and his voice, speaking to me across the years. "If you are reading this," he wrote, "then a few things have happened. First, I am gone. For that, I am sorry. I hope my passing was peaceful, and I hope you were not alone when you heard the news. Second, it means that life has probably thrown you a curveball or two. I know you, my girl. You are stronger than you think, but you are also kinder than this world sometimes deserves. You trust too easily. I worry that someone might have taken advantage of that kindness." A sob caught in my throat. It was as if he had seen Liam, had known that someone like him would come along eventually. Third, and most importantly, it means you have found your way back here, to this barn. I am so sorry for the state of things. I need you to know that the debts, the selling of the land, the loss of the house, it wasn't because I failed. It wasn't because I didn't care. It was a choice. A long time ago, when your mother got sick, the doctors said there was nothing they could do. But I found a place, an experimental treatment. It cost a fortune. It didn't save her, in the end. But it gave us 6 more months with her. 6 months of laughter, of stories, of peace. I would pay that price 1,000 times over. But it cost me the farm. I sold everything I could to give her that time. I never told you because I didn't want you to carry that burden. I wanted you to remember the home, not the cost of it. I was weeping freely now, big, silent tears rolling down my cheeks and dripping onto the dusty floor. The shame I had carried, the quiet, buried belief that my grandfather had somehow been irresponsible, that he had let it all slip away, dissolved in a wave of grief and love. It wasn't abandonment, it was a sacrifice. "I have not left you much, Maya," the letter continued. Not much in the way of money, anyway. Liam, I'm sorry, the world, values things you can count. But I have left you this place, this barn. It may not look like much. The world will tell you it's worthless. A lawyer will tell you to sell it for scrap. Do not listen. They only ever see the surface. You, Maya girl, have to look deeper. The blueprints in this box are not for the house. They are for other things, better things. This barn is not an ending. It is a beginning. Your beginning. I have left you the tools. I have left you the space. The rest is up to you. This is your inheritance. Not a sum of money, but a chance. A chance to build something that no one can ever take away from you. Start with the hearth. My love, always, your Grandpa Thomas. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. The weight of his love, his foresight, his incredible sacrifice settled over me. He hadn't just left me a building. He'd left me a purpose. He'd left me a map out of the darkness. But looking around the decaying barn, at the cobwebs and the grime and the sagging roof, the purpose felt impossibly large. The map was written in a language I didn't understand. The grief and love were soon joined by a third, colder emotion. Sheer, unadulterated terror. I just sat there on the floor for what felt like hours, the letter clutched in my hand, feeling completely and utterly broken. The initial wave of catharsis receded, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of my situation. I was homeless. I had $17. I was squatting in a condemned barn on a piece of land that would be seized for back taxes in 3 months. My inheritance wasn't a lifeline. It was an anchor, threatening to pull me under. The sheer scale of the task ahead was crushing. Fix the roof, clear the land, get the electricity turned on, if that was even possible. And for what? To learn a trade I knew nothing about? To build better things from faded blueprints? Mr. Henderson's pragmatic voice echoed in my head. It's a shed, kid. Sell it. The developer's offer, which had seemed like an insult before, now sounded like a reasonable, sensible escape hatch. A few $1,000s. It would be enough for a deposit on a small apartment, enough to get back on my feet, to find a normal job. It was the easy way out. The sane way out. And I want to pause here for a second, because I was at a crossroads, and I know some of you watching have been there too. If you have ever been at a point where giving up felt like the only logical, sensible option, I want you to let me know in the comments. Tell me about it. Because this community is for people who understand that moment of despair. It's for people who know what it's like to find the strength to take that next step, even when every part of you is screaming to turn back. We're in this together, and your story matters. Now, back to that dusty floor. I was so close to giving up. I was ready to pack my box, walk back to that lonely road, and stick out my thumb. But my grandfather's letter was still in my hand. I smoothed it out and read it one more time. 2 phrases snagged in my mind. The first was, they only ever see the surface. You have to look deeper. The second was the final instruction. Start with the hearth. At the back of the barn, built into the foundation, was a small brick forge, a hearth where my grandfather would have heated metal for repairs. It was cold and black, filled with old ashes and debris. It seemed like a strange place to begin, but I had nothing else to go on. I took my phone and aimed its light into the dark opening. It was just a brick firebox, coated in soot. I ran my hands along the inside, my fingers coming away black. I felt nothing but rough brick and crumbling mortar. Maybe he meant it metaphorically. Start with the heart of the place. But my grandfather wasn't a man for metaphors. He was a man of substance, of tangible things. I looked closer, examining each brick. One, on the left side, seemed different. The mortar around it was a slightly lighter shade of gray, and it wasn't quite flush with the others. My heart gave a little skip. I pushed on it. It didn't budge. I pried at the edge with the screwdriver I'd used on the lock. A little bit of mortar flaked away. I kept working at it, chipping away at the seal, until finally the brick loosened. I pulled it out. Behind it was a dark, square cavity. And inside that cavity was another metal box. This one was smaller, a simple cash box, not locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lift it out. It was heavy. I opened the lid, and I gasped. It was full of cash. Stacks of 20s and 50s bound with rubber bands. It wasn't a life-changing fortune, but it was more money than I had ever seen in one place. I counted it quickly, my fingers clumsy. It was a little over $5,000, enough to pay the property taxes for years, enough to buy food, supplies, enough to live on for months while I figured things out. It was a lifeline. It was a choice. Beneath the money was another bundle of letters, tied with the same kind of twine as before. These were different, thicker. I opened the top one. The date was from a few months before he died. Maya, it read. If you found the money, it means you chose to stay. I am proud of you. I knew you had it in you. This money is from my last few commissions. I did them off the books. It should be enough to give you a running start. Now, the real work begins. The wood I left you in the loft is not just any scrap pine. Look for the stacks with a small star burned into the end grain. That is black walnut, salvaged from a pre-colonial bridge that washed out in the flood of '78. It is seasoned for over 40 years. There is cherry from the old miller's orchard and quarter-sawn oak from a church that was torn down. It is rare. It is valuable. But its true value is not in its price. It is in its potential. It is waiting for the right hands. Your hands. But wood like that can be unforgiving. You need to understand it before you can shape it. Find my ledger. It is hidden where I kept my other stories. It will teach you what you need to know. I looked up from the letter, my gaze traveling to the shadowy loft. The wood. I scrambled up the rickety ladder, my phone's light bouncing ahead of me. And there they were. Several neat stacks of dark, rich-looking timber, set apart from the rest. I ran my hand over the end of one of the boards, and there it was. A small, 5-pointed star burned into the grain. It was real. All of it. The money in the box wasn't the treasure. The wood was. The knowledge was. He hadn't just left me a puzzle. He'd left me a complete curriculum. My choice was no longer a choice. It was a calling. I climbed down from the loft, my body thrumming with a new energy, a fierce, protective sense of purpose. I was not selling this place. I was not running away. I was staying. I was going to learn. I was going to build. I walked over to a dusty broom leaning against the wall, took it in my hands, and with a wide, satisfying sweep, I began to clear a space for myself on the floor. The dust rose in a cloud, and in the beam of my light, for the first time, it didn't look like decay. It looked like potential, waiting to be stirred. The days that followed blurred into a routine of disciplined, back-breaking work. My life became measured in small, tangible victories. The first section of floor swept clean. The first grimy window washed, letting in a rectangle of pure, unfiltered sunlight. The first night I spent not in a shelter, but rolled in a sleeping bag on the floor of the barn. The smell of old wood, a comforting lullaby. The $5,000 was my shield against the world. I used a few hundred to buy a cheap, used mattress, a camp stove, and basic supplies from the nearest town. The rest I guarded fiercely, my budget written out in a small notebook. It was for the taxes, for emergencies, and for the barn. I got a job waitressing at the town's only diner, the Copper Kettle. It was a 45-minute walk each way, but I didn't mind. The walk gave me time to think, to plan. The owner was a woman named Carol, with a steel gray bun and an expression that seemed permanently fixed between a scowl and a smirk. She hired me on the spot. "You look like you're not afraid of hard work," she'd grunted, handing me an apron. She was tough, but fair. She'd pack up leftover food for me at the end of my shifts without saying a word, a silent act of kindness that I cherished. The diner became my link to the outside world, a place of noise and life that contrasted with the monastic silence of the barn. My free time was devoted to the puzzle my grandfather had left me. Find my ledger. It is hidden where I kept my other stories. I searched the barn for days. I looked in every crate, on every shelf, behind every tool. Nothing. I began to think I'd misunderstood. What other stories? He wasn't a writer. He was a builder. I sat on the workbench, frustrated, looking at the small shelf of books he kept above it. They were mostly technical manuals, books on joinery, wood identification, tool maintenance. And then I saw it. A thick, leather-bound copy of Moby Dick. It was the one book I knew he'd read over and over. His other story. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the book from the shelf. It felt too light for its size. I opened the cover, and there, hollowed out from the pages, was his ledger. It was a simple, black-bound book, its pages filled with his neat, angular script. The first half of the book was a meticulous record of his business. Every project, every client, every measurement, every price. It was a masterclass in his craft. But the last 20 pages were different. The heading on the first of these pages read, "For Maya." This was the final letter, the final piece of the puzzle. I sat down on a newly cleaned patch of floor, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, and I began to read his last words to me. "My dearest Maya girl," he began, "if you are reading this, you have found my last secret. You have chosen the harder path. You have chosen to build instead of bail. I am more proud than words can say. Now I can tell you the whole truth. I knew I was sick for a long time before I told anyone. I knew my time was short. And I saw the man you were with, this Liam. I saw the way he looked at you, not with love, but with calculation. I saw the way he looked at this property, not as a home, but as an asset. I knew he would try to take everything from you when I was gone. A predator can smell weakness, and grief, my dear girl, can make anyone weak. My hands were shaking. He had known. He had seen it all. So I made a plan, the letter went on. A desperate, crazy plan. I couldn't leave you a simple inheritance of money. He would have found a way to take it. I couldn't leave you the house. The debts were too great, and he would have seen its value. So I had to leave you something that looked worthless to a man like him. Something he would discard. Something that only you would see the value in. I left you the barn. I structured the will specifically, making Lot B a separate, legally protected entity. An island. It was the only way to give you something he couldn't touch. It was a gamble. A terrible gamble. I was betting on your strength, on your memory of this place, on the love we shared. I was betting that you would come back here, that you would choose to fight. He had orchestrated the entire thing. The worthless inheritance, the overlooked asset, it was all a carefully constructed fortress, designed to protect me from beyond the grave. It wasn't an accident of paperwork. It was an act of fierce, desperate, protective love. The greatest lie in the world, Maya, he wrote, is that inheritance is about money. Money can be stolen. It can be squandered. True inheritance is skill. It's purpose. It's the ability to make something beautiful and strong with your own two hands. That is what I have left you. The tools, the wood, the knowledge in this book, and this space to do the work. It won't be easy. You will get splinters. You will be frustrated. You will want to quit. Don't. Every time you plane a board smooth, every time you cut a perfect joint, you will be building more than just a piece of furniture. You will be building yourself. A self that is strong, independent, and whole. A self that no one can ever break again. The final pages of the ledger were not words, but drawings. Step-by-step instructions for his most fundamental techniques. How to sharpen a plane blade until you could shave with it. How to cut a dovetail joint that would hold for a century. How to read the grain of a piece of wood like a map. It was everything. His life's work distilled into a final gift. Just as I finished reading, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered, my voice thick with emotion. "Am I speaking with Maya Leston?" a slick professional voice asked. "Yes," I said. "My name is Mark Corrigan. I represent the Ridgewood Development Group. We've recently acquired the parcels of land surrounding your property on Old Mill Road. We'd like to make you a formal offer for your quarter-acre, Lot B, to complete the tract for our new housing development." I could hear the condescension in his voice, the assumption that he was talking to some clueless kid he could easily railroad. I thought of Liam. I thought of my grandfather's letter. "We are prepared to offer you $7,000, he said, as if bestowing a great gift. "It's a generous offer for an undeveloped, inaccessible plot with a condemned structure on it." I took a deep breath. The old me, the me from a few weeks ago, would have been intimidated. She would have stammered, or maybe even accepted. But the old me was gone. I was standing in my inheritance. I was surrounded by the legacy of a man who had bet everything on my strength. "Mr. Corrigan," I said, my voice quiet, but as solid as the oak in the loft. "Thank you for your offer, but the property is not for sale." There was a pause on the other end. "Miss Leston, perhaps you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I interrupted, a new, unfamiliar fire in my veins. "You see a condemned structure. I see a functioning workshop. You see an inaccessible plot. I see my home. You see a nuisance. I see my future. So with all due respect, my answer is no. And it will continue to be no. Please don't call again." I hung up before he could respond. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with my own power. I had faced the wolf in a different form, and I hadn't backed down. I had stood my ground. For the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, unshakably safe. The resolution wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of a different kind of life, one built not on what was given to me, but on what I could create. The developer sent a few more letters, each one with a slightly higher offer, each one a little more threatening in its legal jargon. I used some of the money my grandfather left to have Mr. Henderson, who seemed vaguely impressed, send them a firm cease and desist letter. They finally left me alone, their perfect tract of land forever marred by my stubborn little quarter-acre island. My days were long and filled with the ache of physical labor. I patched the roof, using salvaged tin from a collapsed shed down the road. I reglazed the old windows. I sanded the workbench down to its original pale maple surface. And I began to study the ledger, practicing my grandfather's techniques on scrap wood until my hands were raw with blisters and splinters. My first dovetail joints were clumsy, gapped. My first attempts at planing were uneven. But I didn't stop. I could feel him there with me, his ghostly presence guiding my hands, his voice a whisper in my ear. "Patience, Maya girl. Persuade it." Slowly, something began to shift. The barn transformed from a dusty tomb into a living, breathing workshop. The scent of fresh-cut sawdust replaced the smell of decay. The ring of a hammer and the rasp of a saw replaced the silence, and I transformed with it. My muscles grew stronger, my hands more calloused and capable. The fear and self-doubt that had haunted me for years began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence. I learned to trust myself, my hands, my instincts. One day, I took one of the smaller boards of the salvaged black walnut, the wood that felt sacred in my hands, and I began to build something from the blueprints. It was a small, simple jewelry box, but it was intricate, with delicate joinery and a perfectly fitted lid. It took me a month. When it was finished, I sanded it with finer and finer grit paper until it felt like silk. I rubbed it with oil, and the wood's deep, chocolate-brown grain came alive, its 40 years of waiting finally over. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And I had made it. I held it in my hands, this solid, tangible proof of my own resilience. And I knew, with a certainty that reached into my very bones, that I was going to be okay. Starting over is one of the most terrifying things a person can do. It feels like a free fall. But I've learned that sometimes the things we think we've lost are just making space for what we were always meant to find. What Liam took from me was just stuff. It was money, furniture, 2 years of my time. It felt like everything, but it was nothing. What my grandfather left me, what Liam in his blindness and greed allowed me to find, was a chance. A chance to build something real. A chance to build a home, not with 4 walls and a roof someone else provided, but with my own 2 hands. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to find your own strength in the wreckage of a life you thought you knew, please subscribe and become a part of this community. This channel is for the builders, the fixers, the survivors. Share your own story of rebuilding in the comments below. I promise you, I read every single one because I believe every story of resilience matters. Thank you for being here with me. You're not alone.